Welcome to the first episode of Inside Crime, The Experts. In this series, we're going to bring regular updates on what is making the news in the crime genre from both Australia and from around the world. What we'll be doing is taking you inside some of the most challenging crimes and mysteries. Many of these are unsolved. They're the stories of serial killers, murderers, organised crime, disappearances, scams, frauds and heists. That rich tapestry of crime. We'll be bringing our expert views to those crimes. And so now to our experts. Tim Watson-Munro is Australia's leading criminal psychologist. He's delved into the minds and crimes of some of the most notorious criminals in Australia and around the globe. Dr Xanthe Mallett is an internationally renowned criminologist and Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Newcastle. And lastly, I'm Duncan McNab. I started my life of crime as a detective in policing, moved into major criminal defence in the corporate sector, before heading into the world of media as an investigative journalist, an author and documentary maker. Over the last few months, the three of us have been involved in a lot of TV appearances offering commentary on major cases. So a quick update on a couple of those we've been looking at over that period. Despite massive investigations and a few moments of hope, Ballarat's Samantha Murphy, who disappeared while on a morning run in February 2024, has still yet to be found. Patrick Stevenson, the man charged with her murder, is back in court on the 8th of August in Melbourne. He hasn't entered a plea yet. Erin Patterson, charged with 3 counts of murder and 5 counts of attempted murder, largely arising from her alleged use of poisonous mushrooms in a beef Wellington she served to former in-laws in July last year, is back in court on the 21st of August. This is the Supreme Court of Victoria. She has entered a plea of not guilty, and this will be a directions hearing. Trial will be coming up at some stage in the future. Back in Sydney, Beaumont Lamar Condon, to give him his full name, the now former New South Wales police officer charged with the murders of Jesse Baird and Luke Davies at Paddington in February this year, is also back in court, this time on the 13th of August. He's been served the brief of evidence but has yet to enter a plea. His very talkative lawyer has told media outside the court that it was too early to tell whether a mental health defence would be raised or whether the matter would go to trial. The lawyer is a little bit too talkative. Great for us in the media, but I'd suggest a polite no comment might be a smarter move. This last crime is one of those terrible events where the photo of those 2 young blokes, happy, full of life, is one you just can't get out of your mind. In each of the cases I've mentioned, the people are in prison. Bail has been refused. This week, our experts will be focusing on the deaths of campers Russell Hill, 74 years old, and Carol Clay, 73, in Victoria's Alpine National Park in March 2020. Gregory Lynn, a 57-year-old former Jetstar pilot, was charged with their murders. And last week, the jury came back after a 4-week trial and found that Mr. Lynn was guilty of the murder of Miss Clay, but not guilty of the murder of Mr. Hill. His trial started in the Victorian Supreme Court on the 14th of May. The verdict was delivered on the 25th of June 2024. This case has been strange throughout, a lot of bizarre twists and turns in the case, and that continued until the jury came down with their verdict. We either expected an acquittal or a guilty verdict for both, but we got a split verdict, one not the other. Very unusual, and to reiterate, as the judge pointed out, in this case, there was no option for manslaughter. It was guilty of murder or not guilty, choice of 2.
Yeah, it's a very unusual case, Duncan. It's the only witness that the defence called was the accused person, and he gave evidence, and it seemed in terms of, I mean, we don't know what goes on in jury rooms, of course, but in terms of the queries they had of the judge, whilst they were making their deliberations, they wanted to see the audio-visual tape of Greg Lynn's evidence in full, involving, I think, examination in chief and cross-examination. There was then a question about whether they could find one guilty and one not guilty. And then, of course, after a period, I think, of about 7 days of deliberation, they came back with the verdict that you've described. I thought, based on the evidence that was presented, it was certainly an unexpected result.
Yeah, I think the first heads up we got that it may be a split verdict was when they asked the judge whether that was a possibility. I think that was on the Monday that the verdict was actually handed down. Until then, I am not a betting woman, but I would have laid money on both going one way or the other. And I did not know which way it was going to go. I've given up years ago trying to predict what a jury is going to do. But until that moment, there was no real indication that they would split that decision. And from what we have seen, it is a very curious decision. But as Duncan, as you said, it's been a curious case from the very beginning. It's, you know, the fact that they weren't allowed a manslaughter as an alternative, it had to be unanimous. And the fact that he gave evidence, all of these things make it extremely unusual. And I think the jury had a really tough time in this case to reach a decision. I was concerned it might actually end up with a hung jury and a mistrial. So we got a conclusion, but I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of Mr. Greg Lynn.
I agree with you, Xanthe. I think they had no alternative other than to call the accused person, that is the defence. And what it actually boiled down to, or titrated down to, after a very protracted trial, 47 witnesses, was whether or not the jury believed his account of what occurred.
But the outcome was kind of like they didn't believe all of it. They seemed to believe some of it and not other bits.
Well, that's the magic of juries. You know, I've been kicking around the courts for 4 decades. I'm never surprised, or perhaps we should always be surprised, but we have to respect the decision of the court and the jury.
And I'm with you guys. I was thinking exactly the same thing up until that. It'll either be a hung jury or a murder conviction on both, possibly an acquittal, though that was on the lower order of my thoughts.
The psychology of jury rooms and verdicts is something that's worthy of deep research.
I would love to know what goes on in jury rooms, especially in a case like this. How they reach this verdict, I think, would be a fascinating journey if you've been a fly on that wall.
Have you ever been in a room at a meeting with 12 people, all of them agreeing with each other, unless it's perhaps for a pay rise?
I'm an academic. No.
No one agrees with anyone. Media is much the same. There's usually a bun fight before you come to a decision. There's always going to be someone a bit disgruntled. But this jury have come back with a unanimous 12-person and the judgment they brought in. It's a tough call for the jurors. And, you know, always remember, they've got the fate of this bloke in their hands and also their responsibility, well, not necessarily their responsibility, but also the impact their decisions will have on the families, victims' families, the police involved, all the witnesses involved. With a split decision, there's also the question of double jeopardy and a possible appeal against the conviction. Yep.
They can't go back and revisit the not guilty decision. That's out of the way. The Crown can't appeal it. So it then creates a very interesting legal conundrum, doesn't it? In terms of trying the evidence again and finding maybe fault with the decision of the verdict or not. It's going to be interesting to watch.
And as we've seen in a lot of recent cases, particularly, the Court of Appeal might come back and quash the conviction of murder and recommend a retrial, in which case the Director of Public Prosecutions then has to consider whether or not they'll give that retrial. So many variables in play in this case. I think we've got at least 18 months, 2 years worth to see what's going to happen. And of course, coming up very shortly will be the sentencing. That'll be intriguing to see what evidence comes forward in that.
Normally, with murder trials, murder charges, and I've done, I don't know, probably 200 in my career, there's always an assessment by a psychiatrist and a psychologist, always. Well, when I say always, that's not always the case. There's the recent case of Farquharson that's now being revisited in the media, but there was no real psychiatric evaluation of him, as I understand it. The other thing that intrigued me about this case, and here we are talking about it still, but there's been such national and international interest in it. Duncan, you're a media guy. What do you reckon's behind all of that?
Australia is very much in vogue too in the international media with some of our more intriguing murder cases. The Leon Gather one I mentioned, the Beef Wellington, for example, put us very much on the map. And I think that may have also spiked a lot of interest in this trial going up. But a couple of other elements that always grab me about it: he's a Jetstar pilot, for example, a highly skilled person, a cool head, a person who used to making decisions. When the engine, for example, fails on a 2-engine jet, you don't panic and run around the cabin. You get out your manual and you very methodically go through what you need to do. having a pilot as a murderer, a convicted murderer in this case, is fascinating. The location, Victoria's high country, remote, and we've also seen stories about other people who've gone missing, believed murdered in that same area. So that adds a little bit of an edge to it. Yes.
4 have gone missing in a 60-kilometre radius of these two. So
Now that might sound like a bit of a pattern to some people.
it doesn't sound like a coincidence to me, put it that way.
And for those of us who sort of, and I think Xanthe and I've discussed this particularly beforehand, there's a notion of geographical profile,
Yes,
where
yes,
people, for example, hunt their victims, and
yes.
it's just basic animal behaviour. Like, if you're a lion and you want to go and find dinner, you go and find dinner near the watering hole.
And you go to places you know, and if you know that you're going to be successful there, you keep going back. If that's where easy dinner is found, that's where you go.
Xanthe and I did a 4-hour documentary about 4 years ago called Buried Secrets that you're probably aware of, Duncan, looking at the crimes of Ivan Milat.
Yep.
Now, he was a marauding serial killer, and years before he was detected, I was interviewed about the bodies, and I said, well, who knows who it is, but I think you can say with a fair degree of certainty that this person will live close to the Hume Freeway and near to an on-ramp or an off-ramp, and because he accesses the freeway, that's where he goes hunting. So you're quite right. They have territorial patches, they go marauding, and as Xanthe points out, if you're successful once or twice, you'll keep going, won't you?
One of those 4 unsolved cases is the disappearance of a guy called David Prideaux, who at the time, I think he went missing, was in charge of Melbourne's Barwon prison.
Well, he walked off up the bush path, as I understand it. They were on a hunting trip.
Yep.
And he was never seen again. And I think it's an interesting connection. Barwon is, I think, probably the most difficult of prisons in Victoria, if not Australia. They have aspects to Barwon that are like Supermax in Goulburn, and a lot of the so-called underworld people are lodged there. I don't know. I don't believe in coincidence much. The fact that you've got 3 others within 60 kilometres of one another, what's the probability of that happening?
Yeah, and all within a reasonably tight timeline as well. You have to start scratching your head. I suppose other parts of this thing that grabbed me, and I'll go to Xanthe quickly, the crime scene is unusual. And it reminds me, you've got bodies moved, fire and that sort of stuff. And it just reminds me, before heading off to Xanthe, of an old quip I got from a bandito acquaintance of mine I've interviewed over the years. And he always said to me, one of the things you need to remember at a crime scene is that fire fucks forensics. And whilst that might not have been core in Mr. Lynn's thinking, it's certainly done a bloody good job at this crime scene.
And it's fabulous alliteration when you think about it.
It is. It's stuck in my mind when he dropped it in the course of a conversation and I've been able to get it out. So maybe, Xanthe, if you're going to take us through the crime scene, or what wasn't the crime scene more to the point?
Well, yeah, it was highly problematic. So obviously when the police arrived at that scene, and Greg Lynn made open admissions about this when he was interviewed, is that he burnt that scene. And burning, as your bandito acquaintance said, it really does mess up the evidence. So really there was very little. Everything was destroyed. They didn't have footprints to look at. It'd been a number of days out in the open. Everything was burnt, and fire really does destroy. So they didn't have DNA. They didn't really know what they were looking at in those early days. And obviously they had no bodies. The bodies weren't discovered until later, until Greg Lynn made another admission about that. And they found them via, I believe, video link from when he was actually in prison. They had to go out and try and find where he said he had moved the bodies to. He'd left them for a number of weeks and gone back and also burnt them. So when you said you don't know whether, that forensic countermeasure, as we would describe it formally, to burn the bodies and the evidence, whether that was high on his mind, clearly it must have been, because he went back and then destroyed the bodies weeks later. To the point when the forensic anthropologist from the Victoria Institute of Forensic Medicine, a colleague of mine, Soren Blau, had to actually collect that evidence. They sieved for it. We're talking tiny, tiny fragments of bone. She was able to identify a number of those, but of the 2,100 or so that were recovered, not all of them were identifiable. They were so highly fragmented and damaged. What she was able to do is determine that they reflected two people because they were repeat elements. So you're only going to have, for one person, they're only going to have one upper arm bone, right arm bone. They're going to have a pair, but one will be right, one will be left. If you can determine that there are two right upper arm bones, you have a minimum number of two people. And she was able to determine that, and some of those elements were identified as Carol Clay's via DNA, but we're talking high fragmentation. You should only have about 206 bones in the average adult human body. 2,100 fragments recovered. That is really quite astonishing because bone is pretty hardy. That is a serious fire to do that level of damage.
Does this verdict establish a blueprint for successful murder?
It does concern me enormously, and I think we've seen it particularly in the Sydney and Melbourne gang wars of late, where you see they've used a car to go to the crime scene, they've committed a murder, a drive-by shooting, an assassination, whatever it happens to be, and the first thing they do is take the car that they've used to somewhere else and they set fire to it. And they burn it to the ground, which has a reasonable chance of breaking that link in the crime, in the train of evidence. I think we may see it again. It's going to be tough for courts and police at this stage, because if you literally burn any usable evidence, we might there is a possibility that a lot of guilty people will be walking free, and that's quite horrifying.
I always do have this slight concern that I'm actually educating not only the next generation of people who will work in the criminal justice system, but those who may in fact interact with it, and teaching them how not only to investigate a scene, but in some ways how to get away with it. And when people ask me, how would I get away with murder? That always makes me a bit twitchy, and people must ask you, Duncan, as well.
Yeah.
How would you get away with it and not get caught? And I was like, yeah, not going there.
If they're taking too many notes, you'd start getting a little bit
Or
concerned.
recording you, it's like,
Or recording you. A couple of people have asked me that very question. I've suggested that they watch CSI, which is guaranteed to get them convicted.
They'll get caught. Absolutely. CSI will get them caught.
Yeah, I've got to do the right thing by the justice system. So yeah, please watch CSI. Watch it very closely and follow their lead.
But generally, the destruction of evidence reflects a consciousness of guilt, so-called, and
But I would caution. I mean, I've heard about those calls to change the law as well. It always makes me a little twitchy when legislation is brought in response to a high-profile crime, because often there are further implications of changes to the law which aren't foreseen at the time.
I wonder what's going to happen now with Mr. Lynn. He's got 4 weeks, well, less than 4 weeks, 3 weeks to appeal now, and he has to seek leave to appeal. But then there'll be, if they get leave to appeal, watch this space. It's going to be a fascinating process to observe.
And it will be an absolutely fascinating process to observe. And on top of that, there are some recent reports after the trial, things that the jury weren't allowed to hear.
Yes, there were, weren't there?
And that's pretty common in most criminal cases. There are a lot of stuff that is canvassed beforehand that the jury can't hear because, broadly speaking, if they hear it, it might be prejudicial. Trials have to be conducted with scrupulous fairness, and as the judge did in this case. But subsequently, we've heard what the jury didn't hear. That's fascinating. And there's a report this morning, and it was out in the Age newspaper, talking about a number of other crimes that are close to Mr. Lynn, geographically close particularly, and people he's had some problems with. And the article, and whilst it doesn't suggest, and there's no evidence to suggest Mr. Lynn maybe have any involvement in these alleged crimes at this stage, there is the death of his wife by suicide some years beforehand. I think she died in, and he said, referring to his notes somewhere, Lisa died in 1999 with the suicide finding.
But there was no note, was there? She died.
Yeah.
My understanding is she was found in the driveway of their home. The 2 young children, 2 daughters, I believe, were still in sleep.
Yep.
And she died of, I think it was alcohol and drugs. And a conclusion of suicide was given by the coroner. But there was no note of suicide as far as I'm aware. And she was just curled up in the fetal position on the driveway of the home.
Yeah, so the report this morning in the Age notes that she died from a cocktail of prescription medication and alcohol. There is a note in the article that Lisa didn't drink very often at all, and the coroner allegedly delivered an open finding into her death. But apparently we'll be asked to have a second inquest upon receiving information. According to the article in The Age, police have re-interviewed multiple people over Lisa's death, telling one witness they were looking at other cases that may involve Greg Lynn, which is the unsubtle segue of mine into the other case that gets mentioned in the article, which is the death of two of his neighbours in Mount Macedon in, he said, 2010. Again, it's curious in this article because these two people, it was allegedly a murder-suicide.
Involving too the murder of their dogs.
What?
Yeah.
Shot as well.
No, why
And
did they murder the dogs? Leave the
wait for
dogs
it, and then
out of
all
it.
of that was followed by a fire.
Oh, I don't actually know. This is going to be super interesting as this
Yeah.
unfolds.
Yeah, the case is really intriguing. I'll just go through it very quickly. And this is one that I suspect the police might be looking at reopening. And according to the Age reports, it was a couple living in Mount Macedon, not terribly far from where Mr. Lynn lived. And according to the article, on the March the 29th, 2010, a passenger saw, a person in the car saw a fire at the property on Zigzag Road, Mount Macedon. When they got to the house, they found 3 pet dogs, Hungarian Vizslas,
Oh no.
who had been shot to death in the laundry. What the police found and reported to the coroner was that the place had been extensively damaged by fire, not much in the way of crime scene evidence again. The woman had been shot while she was in bed. The husband was found on a chaise lounge, apparently, after having committed suicide using a .22 caliber firearm. He was not known to have actually had a gun or have any interest in guns. The evidence that the police found was that he'd actually been to visit his naturopath this morning. Everyone was healthy, happy, looking at their future. And that night they're found dead, a murder-suicide ostensibly, with 3 dogs killed and the house set fire to. There was a quirk in the article which notes also that at the time the fire started, both people were still alive. So there was obviously some evidence in their lungs that they were still
Yeah,
in the
they
fire
were
started.
breathing in the smoke.
Yeah, it's a really quirky case, and there is some evidence to suggest from the neighbours that Mr. Lynn had had some sort of dispute with them, or he wasn't very happy with them. According to one neighbour, he's a man who could bear a grudge for 100 years. Yeah,
I make no comment about him. I don't think it's proper to do so. But having said that, there's an enormous number of coincidences in this case. And often what you find is a conviction for one murder may lead the police to agitate for another coronial inquest. And out of that, there may be further recommendations. But
And you can see why they would in this case, as you say, like there are a lot of similarities between that incident and the Russell Hill and Carol Clay deaths. So you can see why the police would certainly look at it again. It would be remiss of them not to.
yeah, but I think also it's important not to read too much into it at the moment. We don't want to prejudice his rights on appeal. And that's an interesting question too. We should at some point get a lawyer in to talk about how do you actually get a fair trial now in the wake of all this new evidence, if he gets a retrial. Where do you find 12 people around Australia who could come to this with an open mind? I think it's a very perplexing issue.
There are so many legal twists and turns in this, and I think there are going to be a lot more to come.
There might be an opportunity, for example, if a retrial was a reality, then you do it judge alone. I don't know whether that's permissible in Victoria. It's a bit of a mixed bag around Australia.
But I think there are more serial killers in this country than have actually been identified. We're not good at linking up, I don't think, serial crimes, especially across states and territory borders.
And you're right about the borders, and being a copper back in the old dark days, and it's got better recently, but the border was a really good way to avoid a crime if you just crossed the border.
And people did. We know people did.
Yeah, and I think in all these cases, the thing that I have to really stress in all these cases, the speculation is fabulous and it's really intriguing, and it brings some light on the case that may stir people to come forward with that one little bit of evidence that will kick it along. But the bottom line is you never assume how the case is going to work out. You let the evidence take you step by step till you get to that eureka moment where that last bit of the jigsaw puzzle slots into place. Up until then, it's just talk. Been a terrific conversation about this incredibly perplexing case, and one that we'll be talking about, I think, quite a few times in the coming future.
So, thank you and welcome to Inside Crime.
Thanks very much. Good to talk to you and looking forward to more of our chats.
Coming up in our next episode of Inside Crime, the Experts, we're going to be having an in-depth look at the Victorian case of Robert Farquharson in jail for the murder of his young sons. There are a lot of questions being raised about the veracity of that conviction, and in particular some of the forensic evidence used at the time. Has that evidence changed over the years? Is Mr. Farquharson still the horrible convicted criminal he's been painted as, or is Robert Farquharson a man in prison for a crime he didn't commit, or perhaps a crime that wasn't even a crime?